You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is acclaimed and award-winning author Randall Woods. He's coming on to discuss his new book, John Quincy Adams, A Man for the Whole People. Mr. Woods, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert. I really appreciate it.
As you can tell by the accent, Mr. Woods is not from Toronto. But Dr. Woods is the Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas. He has won the Robert H. Farrell Book Prize for his biography of William Fulbright. But he's gone back in time a little bit to talk about a scion and also the father of one of the most important political families in the United States in our history. Professor Woods, you've written about so many people, studied so many eras. What about John Quincy Adams drew you to him and to this biography?
I've written biographies, Bill Fulbright, as you said, and Lyndon Johnson, William Colby, who headed the CIA. Spent most of my time in the 20th century in the Cold War. I didn't want to write the same book over and over again. It's time for me to change. I thought changing centuries, changing time would be both give me a fresh eye and refresh me. But I'm a diplomatic historian, teach American foreign policy, and in graduate school, we were taught that John Quincy Adams was the most effective Secretary of State in American history. James Monroe, Secretary of State, he was responsible for the Transcontinental Treaty, which annexed the Floridas and stretched America's boundary to the Pacific. He was the driving force behind the Monroe Doctrine, which defined American foreign policy and still defines it to a certain extent. He was the avatar of Manifest Destiny. But I got into him because he's a very complex person. Because he had a wide-ranging intellect. Estimates are that his IQ was 170. He spoke or wrote 6 languages. He also has a 7,000-page diary, one of the 2 most famous diaries in the English language, the other by Sir Samuel Pepys. And of course, his mother and father, John and Abigail Adams, were powerful intellects, powerful political figures, cultural figures in American history. The other thing is that his life, he was born in 1767 and died in 1848. And he served in public office for 47 out of his 81 years. He went with his father to France when he was 11, when John Quincy was 11, when his father was negotiating the Franco-American Treaty during the American Revolution. And with one short span, he was there until he was 18, fluent in French. He was, by the time he returned to the U.S. at 18, the most traveled American of his generation. And he came back, went to Harvard. He got a law degree, hated the law, hated the practice of the law. And his father, of course, was the second president. And Quincy Adams became dean of the diplomatic corps during the 1790s. He was as much European as he was American, which made him a very effective diplomat. And after his father lost to Thomas Jefferson in 1800, he returned and served in the Senate, and then switched from the Federalist to the Republican Party. and was America's first envoy to the court of Alexander I from 9 until 1815. Very close to Alexander I, a very important relationship for American foreign policy. He was chief negotiator for the Treaty of Ghent, and then he was ambassador to Britain. Came back, was Secretary of State, then the sixth president, lost to Andrew Jackson in 1828. And
wait a second now. He lost Andrew Jackson in 1824, too. Don't leave out that point.
No, he didn't, because the only reason Jackson won was because of the Three-Fifths Clause, which allowed southern states to count slaves as voters.
We'll get into the corrupt bargain later, but yes, you go ahead. Go ahead, Professor. Sorry.
And to his family's made them absolutely distraught. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1831 and served there for 17 years. They couldn't believe that he would lower himself after having been Secretary of serve in the House, because the House was the seat of debate. It was rough and tumble. People with guns and knives. There were 2 bars, separate room for prostitutes. But during that period in his life, he was the scourge of the slave power.
That's right. Well, let me ask you a question. We pay attention to subtitles here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Your subtitle is A Man for the Whole People. Now, the Adams family in general, maybe John Quincy Adams specifically, have this sort of patrician image, reputation, that sort of thing. Why did you choose to subtitle your book A Man for the Whole People? And are the sort of charges against the Adams family, are they valid?
The original subtitle was, in quotes, I would fain be a man for the whole people. That's John Quincy Adams' quote. They wanted to eliminate and just make it a man for the whole people. That was his stated goal. He went against his region's interest repeatedly. He was from New England, Massachusetts, where the banking center, shipping center, business center, and his region opposed continental expansion because the addition of new states would be primarily agricultural, would weaken the political power of the Northeast. But he supported the Louisiana Purchase. As I said, he negotiated the Transcontinental Treaty because he believed that the United States, if it were going to survive in a sea of jealous and ambitious monarchies, had to grow strong, had to grow in population, grow economically, grow in military strength. And he went against the interest of his own people. He was actually expelled from the Senate for supporting Thomas Jefferson in 1807 over the embargo. Quincy Adams, Abigail's father owned 2 slaves, but his parents and he were adamantly opposed to slavery. They saw it as a violation of the Declaration of Independence, obviously. Mm-hmm. But when he was president, he tried to protect the Cherokees in Georgia from having their land auctioned off and stolen. He had close relationships with various free blacks throughout his political career. And then, as I said, he was the scourge of the slave power when he was in the House. He introduced legislation to cancel the Three-Fifths Clause. He introduced legislation to provide for gradual emancipation of the slaves. I had one reviewer said, given his opposition to the South, how can I call him a man for the whole people? He wasn't for forced emancipation. He believed that the South, it was in the white South's interest to do away with slavery. And up until the very last, he hoped that they could be persuaded, that the leadership there could be persuaded to voluntarily do away with slavery. After all, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison, although they were slave owners, described the institution as a blot on the nation. That's why I think that the subtitle is a fairly suitable one. But to your question about them being elitist, they were intellectual elitists, educational elitists for sure. But they weren't wealthy. They had to worry about, both John and Abigail and John Quincy had to worry about money all their lives. They were very poor compared to the slaveholding aristocracy.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Randall Woods. We're discussing his new biography of the 6th president. John Quincy Adams, a man for the whole people. 10 years ago or 14 years ago or so, 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, there were all these stories about how intelligent he was or is, and how he's the most intelligent president ever. And he's obviously very intelligent, as is a lot of other people who have held the office. But all I could think of was like, have none of you commentators actually read anything about John Quincy Adams? To me, Adams is the most naturally brilliant, pure brain power president we've ever had. And when I read the part about his estimated IQ, I chuckled and go, okay, that's actually even sounds low. What is your assessment of John Quincy Adams's just his intellect, which is just, I can only think of as it's spellbinding how intelligent this man was.
It was monumental, and believed his brain power was a function, obviously, of his large brain, but also of his family and his family's expectations of him. He recalled later in life that when he was 10 years old, he heard his parents talking about Paradise Lost and how fascinated they were with it. So he went and snuck into his mother's room and got Paradise Lost and tried to read it 3 times. He recalled that he couldn't understand it, and it actually started smoking. He was 10 years old. When he was 11, and in France with his father, he wrote his brothers a 5-page detailed bibliography of French grammar texts. His brothers were 8 and 5. So he read or spoke 6 languages. He's considered the father of German language in the United States. He was the father of the Smithsonian. He was the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric from 1806 to 1809 at Harvard. He wrote a 2-volume study of the uses of language from the pulpit or from the legislature or from the courtroom. He worshipped Cicero. He believed that rhetoric could change the course of history. He was famously interested in weights and measures, wrote a mind-numbing report for Congress on the history of weights and measures.
I love that, even at Christmas.
And his wife, he and his father were very close and spent a great deal of time in Europe together. And they spent a lot of time buying books. And so the Adams, by the 1830s, probably had the largest library in the United States. He was interested in science. His favorite subject at Harvard, believe it or not, was algebra. And but Adams also had this, he was really the last of the founding fathers. And he not only tried to fortify the nation in terms of geography and economics, but he also understood that the U.S. was born without a history. All the other major nations of the Western world had a long history with their own literature, their own culture. And he was devoted not only to building America's strength physically, but to help it develop its own sense of identity. So he cooperated with Noah Webster on the first dictionary, deciding which words were American and which words were British. He wrote an epic poem himself, not very good, but he was a great patron of the theater and the arts, and his many orations were very historical. So he tried to use his mind to help create an American identity. Really a remarkable person, I think.
A few decades ago, David McCullough wrote his biography of John Adams, and it was seen, maybe not by everybody, but it was seen by some as maybe a rehab project. Presidents, their reputations, their rankings, to the extent rankings are germane, they change during the years. Was any of that in your mind, or was it just, no, I'm going to write about this guy, and wherever everything lands, it lands?
I think McCullough made both John Adams and Harry Truman. Both of those.
That's right.
All of McCullough were not very well thought of. John Quincy Adams was not an effective president. He got virtually nothing done, primarily for political reasons. He was a nationalist. He and his Secretary of State, Henry Clay, they believed in an active active federal government that would work to benefit the entire country, both agriculturalists and business people of all regions. He wanted to create a national university, he supported a national bank. But he came into office at a time when, back in the wake of the Panic of 1819, the federal government, a powerful federal government, was anathema. And Andrew Jackson and his supporters were in tune with that. Also, he came into office at a time in the 1920s when the franchise was being dramatically expanded to include people who were only minimally educated. And he was a traditionalist who believed he deplored people who campaigned, who kissed and slapped backs. He believed that an educated public ought to recognize a virtuous person and on their own vote for them. But boy, was he out of tune.
That actually goes back to the question I asked a couple minutes ago, and the sort of patrician, I'm going to say snob. That's not the right word. Reputation or perception of John Quincy Adams. It may not have been an absolute belief, but relative to Jackson and Rachel Jackson and his supporters, I could see how that contrast is made.
Oh, absolutely. And it was true that he would not condescend to appeal to Irish immigrants and German immigrants. He would not, like Monroe, or like his father, Quincy Adams kept Monroe's cabinet on, a number of whom were Quincy Adams' active political enemies. He didn't believe in the patronage system. He wouldn't go out and campaign. It's true of both John and John Quincy Adams. They loved to study the government and the art of governance, but they were terrible practitioners of it. So I think he deserves a place in American history, a major place in American history, but not so much because of what he did as president of the United States.
That's a great point. I looked up I went on C-SPAN and looked at the presidential historians and the surveys. And John Quincy Adams is pretty consistently in the high teens. But as you mentioned a few minutes ago, if you were ranking secretaries of state, it would be a completely different matter. Why do you think JQA was so effective as Secretary of State, assuming you do, and so ineffective politically as president?
The two activities, the two vocations almost require opposite instincts. As a diplomat, Quincy Adams was a listener. We had no intelligence service, but he was a master gatherer of intelligence. He was a student of other cultures and political systems, and he had an instinct for the power games that the European nations were playing. Politics takes different talents. You have to be very social. You have to be willing to compromise on virtually everything. You have to trade votes. You have to trade favors. And to your point about them being elitist, both John and John Quincy believed that they were above that. And neither one of them were spectacularly successful as presidents. Now, Quincy Adams did some things when he was president that are admirable. His standing up to the militia and government of Georgia as they tried to expel the Cherokees, used his power as far as he could to facilitate internal improvements, canals, roads. But I don't know if he had been president earlier during the era of good feelings, that he would have been more successful. James Monroe, who had held these same principles, is considered a successful president. So it was both a mindset and bad timing, I think.
If you had to, I asked the same question, I think. I don't know if you're familiar with Ambassador Ken Edelman, who was an arms control negotiator under President Reagan and wrote the book Reagan at Reykjavik.
Right.
A terrific book. He's actually coming out with a new version. I asked him, he came on to discuss the passing of Henry Kissinger, and I asked him to come up with his Mount Rushmore of the 4 best secretaries of state in our history. Do you want to take a crack at it? I think he asked me mine, and I think it was Adams, Jefferson, Adams, Seward, and Kissinger, I think, is who I said.
Probably Jefferson, Adams, Seward. Actually, Charles Francis Adams was ambassador to Great Britain.
That's right.
He was ambassador to Great Britain. I think Dean Acheson was an excellent Secretary of State. I think Henry Kissinger is the worst Secretary of State in American history.
I put that on the tee for you. I was hoping you were going to hit it with your driver.
Worst. He knew. I've spent a lot of time with Henry Kissinger. In his papers, in his meetings, he knew nothing. And he constantly overruled people that had spent their life in country, in the language, who knew so much more than he did. And it cost this country dearly.
The reason I specifically mentioned Kissinger was because of your work with Fulbright.
Yeah, they were, during Kissinger's first year in office, he completely mesmerized Fulbright, and flattered him and courted him. But after Kissinger and Nixon continued the war for another 4 years, Fulbright was disillusioned. But actually, Kissinger secretly campaigned against Fulbright when he lost the election here, appealed to the Jewish vote to reject him because of Fulbright's stand on the Middle East.
John Quincy Adams' career as Secretary of State, I think it's probably, I guess we should have mentioned George Shultz maybe as someone else, but that's another podcast. John Quincy Adams' tenure as Secretary of State, it seems to me to be one that solidified the American presence on the world stage. We had survived somehow the absolute military ineptness of the War of 1812. Frankly, got lucky in some ways, in my view. And then here comes a whole nother administration. In 1816, James Monroe, who I think he was Secretary of State too, correct?
Yes.
And so the United States seems to be poised to be a player, or at least be introduced to the world. And by the world at this point, we mean mainly Europe. How did the sum of Adams's experience and knowledge and personality help create this era of good feeling, help create this sense that the United States is no longer 13 colonies?
He was really an absolute magician. He was responsible, and he was ambassador to Great Britain after the War of 1812. You can imagine how difficult a task that was. But he and Lord Castlereagh, who was the British Foreign Secretary, came to an agreement that rapprochement between the U.S. and Great Britain would serve both countries' interests. Britain certainly was the rider of the horse in that rapprochement, but Adams managed to persuade Castlereagh that the U.S. was here to stay, that we had interests in common, and all kinds of good things came out of that. Disarmament on the Great Lakes, agreement on a boundary in the Northwest and the Northeast, a kind of easing of tensions over a period of years that lasted through Quincy Adams' tenure as Secretary of State. After the War of 1812, the arbiter of world affairs was none other than his old friend Alexander, who created and to a certain extent dominated the Holy Alliance. That relationship was extremely important when the Latin American republics began to make their bid for independence in 1811, 1812, culminating in the 1820s. Adams, his relationship with his détente with Great Britain and his relationship with Alexander I kept the Holy Alliance from intervening to restore Spain's and Portugal's colonies to them, paving the way for the Monroe Doctrine, which staked out the Western Hemisphere as a U.S. domain, sphere of interest. At the same time, he took advantage of the Spanish. His goal was to evict Spain and Great Britain, Spain, subsequently Mexico, and Great Britain from the North American continent. And through a series of treaties, he was able to do that. He took advantage of Spain's weakness to negotiate the Transcontinental Treaty. They ceded the Floridas. He persuaded both Russia and Britain not to come to Spain's rescue and help them retain their colonies. It was a sort of act of diplomatic magic that he was able to do that. And given his experience with these people, his direct experience with these people, and his knowledge of European politics and culture, I think no other person could have pulled it off.
Let's stay with Russia for just 1 second. You mentioned earlier his son, Charles Francis Adams, was the U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James, U.S. ambassador to Great Britain during the Civil War. If it's not in the top 3 or 4 best appointments Lincoln made, I'll argue with you, because Adams performed brilliantly over in England. He also has my favorite quote of the whole war, which is crazy considering Lincoln was around, but the layered rams, when he said, John Russell, who was the British foreign minister, it would be superfluous in me to point out to your lordship that this is war. My God, if I could figure out a way to work that into every podcast and every speech I write, I would definitely do so. Brilliant. What'd you say?
Use that in class.
Oh, it's absolutely gorgeous. What a way to put it. And the Brits broke down because by that time in the Civil War, Great Britain wanted no part of the United States. But famously, and somewhat surprisingly to some scholars, maybe not all, Russia was very pro-North, pro-Union during the Civil War. As a matter of fact, they harbored one of their fleets. Was it in San Francisco? But go ahead.
I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah. And so how much of Russia's, we're fast forwarding a little bit. Civil War starts in 1861. John Quincy Adams died in the 1840s. But do you think that there is a relationship between John Quincy Adams's handling of the Romanovs and the Russian support of the Union during the Civil War 13, 14 years later?
I think so, but I must confess my ignorance. For me, it would be speculation. I haven't really studied that relationship. I know that Russia had been a champion of neutrality. That's what brought the two nations together in the years up to Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the War of 1812. They wanted, both the U.S. and Great Britain became major trading partners as the French and British tried to cut off trade with each other, with their enemies. I'm sure that heritage, and Alexander I was an autocrat, but one of the first things he told John Quincy Adams, he said, "I know you're a Republican and I'm fascinated by it and I want to hear more about it." He said, he once said, "I'd like to free the serfs, but I don't know how the country would survive that. I don't know how the economy would survive that." So there was this strain of liberalism, reformist strain in Russian history, and it may have lingered through the Civil War and paid some dividends for the North. But again, I am no expert on the Civil War.
And it was Alexander II, I think Alexander I's grandson, who freed the serfs in the 1860s and eventually paid for it with his life. He was assassinated. You are listening to Go ahead, sir.
You talked about John Quincy, Charles, who was very successful. He was the only surviving son. And I think that's an interesting story.
CFA is next on my list of notes. So let me thank the sponsors and we'll get to it. I actually had to read in graduate school, I had to read Brooke Adams's books.
Yeah, Brooks and Henry. Yeah. Charles Francis's sons, I think.
That's right. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today has written a terrific book about, I hate to say a little known figure, but John Quincy Adams existed in the late 18th century with his dad, his mother, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, maybe not Franklin. He died a little bit earlier, but then goes on and is existing in the political world with Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, James Madison Monroe. And so you can figure out that he got a little bit lost. But Randall Woods has written a new biography, John Quincy Adams, A Man for the Whole People. The Adams family public service, was it something that was expected, or did the men, and we're talking mostly about men because we're talking about serving in elected office or appointed office, or did men just gravitate to it naturally?
I think that John and Abigail were patriots in the real sense of the word. John was in the right place at the right time. He was a lawyer. He became, and of course, the Revolution, particularly as a military conflict, was born in Massachusetts. And when John Quincy was 7, I think, he and his mother stood hand in hand outside their farmhouse and watched the Battle of Bunker Hill. But there's more to this than that. John and Abigail had massive intellects and interests. They were two of the best educated people of their generation. That common education which John shared with Franklin and with Jefferson and with other members of the Continental Congress was that common education, and particularly rooted in classical literature, was what helped them create a sense of community and was what helped them eventually form a nation. But for the Adams were well aware of the fact that they were a founding family, and it was absolutely intoxicating. Absolutely. In a world of monarchies ruled by altar and throne, here was a new form of government, a republic, which could be traced back to the Mayflower, to the whole notion that the refugees from British oppression were destined to create a city on the hill. And so they were part of that, and it was intoxicating, and they imported that particularly to John Quincy. He had brothers, but he was the oldest, and obviously, I think, the brightest. And so he became, particularly Abigail, as you said, ambitious and bright women couldn't really own businesses. They couldn't vote. They couldn't. Right. Their children were their avatars. And she was more ambitious for him than he was for himself. You remember that when he was 11 and traveling to Europe, Abigail wrote him a note, which he received after he arrived. He said, "My dear child, I would rather you sink to the bottom of the sea than commit a dishonorable act that would disgrace your family and your country." She ruined 2 of his romances because she believed that his mistress ought to be his country. He finally very painfully courted and married his wife, kept it secret from his mother until it was virtually a done deal. And Quincy Adams inherited that passion for his country and for public service. And of course, these people were incredibly egotistical. They that didn't make them necessarily bad people. But John Adams was quite an amateur psychologist, and he believed the driving force behind every educated individual was to gain the respect and even adulation of their peers. Now, John Quincy Adams took up the mantle of public service willingly and reveled in it. And his family suffered for it. His alcoholism ran in the Adams family. Abigail's brother drank himself to death. 2 of John Quincy's brothers, Charles and Thomas, both died of alcoholism. Of John Quincy's 3 sons, one committed suicide and the other died of alcoholism. Interestingly enough, Charles Francis, who was the youngest, was the only child that they took to Russia with them. They left the older 2 boys at Abigail's insistence, left them back in Massachusetts. And so for nearly 8 years, they didn't see their parents.
Wow.
Both Louisa and John Quincy were well aware of the toll that took, and they felt guilt as they should have, for their children's later struggles and demise. But Quincy Adams was brutal with his sons in terms of their education. If they didn't meet their marks at Harvard, he wouldn't let them come home for vacation. And his expectations were monumental. And so Charles Francis is the only surviving son. And he was the only son who was able to stand up to his father and create a separate identity. And he later, when his father was in Congress, he said, "Your ambition has nearly destroyed this family. It knows no limits." And John Quincy didn't challenge that. But it's so the family dynamics here, tragic though they were, made for an interesting biography. And John Quincy was a loving man. He was a caring man. This is scene when he arrived at his son's deathbed, and about 4 hours after he died, and he sat with him and held his hand, kissed him, cried. So these are not insensitive people. So there's a sense of tragedy about them. And at the end of his life, John Quincy Adams considered himself a failure. And that's too harsh a word. I think he considered himself very much. He wrote an essay on Hamlet, and which was actually widely published. And he fancied himself a modern day Hamlet. And his sense of the tragic about his public life came from the fact that in promoting Western expansion, he had facilitated the expansion of slavery. And he was extremely conflicted about his own heritage, legacy.
I want to make sure that we get to the John Quincy Adams's abolitionist bent and efforts before we end the podcast. But let's take the listeners back in time to 1824. John Quincy Adams decides to run for president. James Monroe's 2 terms are ending. He's in the race with Henry Clay, William Crawford, and the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. Adams famously loses or does not finish first in the electoral vote, does not finish first in the popular vote, but is elected the 6th president of the United States. Professor Woods, you want to take us through how that could actually happen?
You had none of the had the most popular votes, and he had the most electoral votes, but he did not have a majority of the electoral votes. And the Constitution provided that in that case, the top 3 candidates would be presented to the House of Representatives for their consideration. And each state would have 1 vote. And the person getting the most votes would be elected president. Quincy Adams, Clay was not among the top 3, but he controlled several states, and you use the term corrupt bargaining, which was an invention of Andrew Jackson and his supporters. Clay and Quincy Adams really saw eye to eye. Both of them agreed on the active federal government, so-called American plan, internal, those sorts of things. They saw eye to eye on foreign policy, although they had been enemies as they competed for the nomination. But in short, John Quincy Adams promised Henry Clay Secretary of State to be Secretary of Stateship, and named him Secretary of State. And that's how John Adams became president, because Clay was go ahead.
And Clay and Jackson hated each other.
Absolutely. They were both Westerners, both were competitors with each other for the West. But they wanted to be the political avatar of the West and the bitter enemies he had.
And is it fair to say Adams and Jackson, somewhat ironically, and I want to ask you about this, they had a decent relationship to begin with, and then it degenerated, that Adams, unbeknownst to Jackson, was one of his supporters in the Monroe cabinet, and Clay was never a supporter of Jackson. So this sort of animus that became a true blood feud as a result of the election of 1824, how it all played out. I'm going to say it this way. Was that, in your mind, one of the first tests of the American democracy was the anger over the 1824 election?
Now, the 1828 election, in which Jackson defeated Adams, was until the last few years considered the nastiest, meanest, most mean-spirited election in American history. And but you're right. Quincy Adams actually tried to persuade Andrew Jackson to be his vice president, his running mate, in 1824. Famously, Louisa Catherine Adams threw a grand ball to celebrate the Battle of New Orleans and then New Orleans. But they were on very civil terms. You're quite right. And during the Monroe administration, in the run-up to the Transcontinental Treaty, when Andrew Jackson had unconstitutionally invaded Florida, chasing renegade Indians, in the process seizing control of the Spanish government in Florida, John Quincy Wood is the only one in the Monroe cabinet willing to defend Jackson. They were not destined to be the enemies that they became. And I think the feeling on the part of Adams was much stronger than it was on the part of Jackson.
But to go back to the patrician, snobbish, perhaps educated, enlightened attitude of John Quincy Adams, he could understand how Jackson could be so popular as a general, as a victorious military leader. But I also got the sense that he's, okay, that's one thing, but running the government and being president and a diplomat is something completely different.
Let's get something straight here. Andrew Jackson was much more patrician than the Adams ever thought about being.
You always anticipate my next question.
Much more patrician. He's a slave owner. He's a slave owner. Look at his attitude of the Indians. He is the author of the removal policy. He was a racist, both in terms of red people and black people. He was this he was appalled at what happened at his inauguration when his supporters, the common people, showed up and pulled out his draperies and trounced all over his furniture, and he fled to a nearby hotel. But this was the era of popular politics, and so people running for the presidency increasingly were the creation of the media, the creation of their supporters and the media.
I had David and Jenny Heidler on the podcast, and they wrote the book about a couple of years ago about the media, newspapers in this era of history. Whereas Jackson and his supporters seemed to have mastered this mass communication strategy tactic that was relatively new, and how newspapers made such a big deal. You're talking about the 24 and then 28 elections. Do you think, I don't know if you've read their book, but in general, would you say that the rise, the creation, the financing of partisan newspapers made a difference detrimentally to Adams's political career and presidency?
Absolutely. No question about it. But he could have played that game. He had his supporters. He kept John McLean on as his postmaster general. John McLean was an avid Jackson supporter. And he was postmaster. And post offices all over the country were the funnel through which broadsides and newspapers were funneled to the people. Postmasters could open the mail. They could throw away articles and letters they didn't like. They could alter articles and letters. So Adams, in his political ineptness, kept on as a postmaster general, one of Jackson's chief supporters. He just refused to play the game. And you may say that maybe that wasn't kosher, maybe it should have happened. But in a democracy, if you think about it, it was inevitable. That's how democracies work. So he understood. He didn't feel that. He understood what he wanted to do. And he never stopped wanting to be president, even when he was in the House of Representatives. He kept hoping that the Whigs would nominate him. He kept hoping that the anti-Masons would nominate him. He would not do what it took. He drove his supporters absolutely bonkers because of that.
If you had to, if I said, hey, I've got $50,000, Professor Woods, I'm going to fly you to New York City with an audience of 10,000 people, could you make the case for John Quincy Adams being a more successful president than history and perhaps historians have given him credit?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because he was president of the United States not only for 4 years, he was president of the United States until he died in 1848. Joseph Gaines, Major General, came to Adams in 1834 or 35, came by his house, and he said, "You're the only president I've ever had." And Adams,
What do you mean by that? Oh, go ahead, forgive me.
Adams said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "You're the only nonpartisan president. You're the only president who didn't put their party first. And so you're the only real president I've ever known." And Adams had that as dearly as it cost him politically. In a sense, his refusal to engage in partisan politics endeared him to the public, gave him an aura of prestige and integrity that even impressed the Southern senators and representatives who in situations which did not involve slavery praised him to the skies. So his presidency began in 1824, but it didn't really end until he died.
And how much of that is related to and he wasn't alone, obviously, because other people were picking up the cudgel with regard to abolitionism, the coming conflict, the inevitability, irrepressible conflict. Maybe that's the way I should say it, thanks to William H. Seward. But he wasn't the only one. But why was Adams so prominent in the abolitionist movement?
He had not a love-hate relationship, but he refused to join the American Anti-Slavery Society. And until the very end of his career, he refused to introduce legislation in Congress, which would call for the mandatory emancipation of slaves. There's several things here. He never wavered in his belief that slavery was a moral blot on the country. He came to believe that the Constitution was corrupt. In one of his speeches railing against the Three-Fifths Clause, he referred to it as a minstrel rag. And he wanted to break apart the alliance that Martin Van Buren had created between the slave states and what Martin Van Buren referred to was the Plain Republicans of the North. These were tradesmen and small business people who had been victimized by the Panic of 1819 and had come to see their salvation in states' rights. So he wanted to break that apart, and he knew he could never secure a vote in Congress providing for the abolition of slavery. So he focused more on free speech and sectional power, telling the Mid-Atlantic states and the Northern states that you no longer can support an alliance which is dominated by Southerners, which slavery aside are acting against your economic interests. And in 1836 for the first time, Adams and his abolitionist friends were flooding Congress with hundreds of thousands of petitions demanding from people all over the country, demanding the abolition of slavery, particularly in the District of Columbia. In 1836, I hope my memory serves me correctly, a Southern congressman proposed a rule which required the tabling of all petitions without debate.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gag rule. So effectively, for the next 8 years, slavery was not allowed to be debated on the floor of the House. Adams, who was a master parliamentarian, continually found an end run around ways to do that and, scourged the slave power. But this denial of the right of petition, Adams used to try to drive a wedge between the Southern Northeastern alliance that Jackson and Van Buren had done. He talked about the rights of free people in this country and the absolutely fundamental importance of the right of petition to being a free male American. And that began to have an effect because he finally succeeded in having that gag rule repealed. But you can see there was anti-abolitionist feeling very strong in New York and Massachusetts and other ports, and that continued through the 30s and into the early 40s. But you can see the newspapers and the political debate in the mid-Atlantic and northeastern states began to turn on the fulcrum of this idea of denial of right of petition and the right to free speech. And so it didn't solve the problem. But that alliance broke up. That intersectional alliance that Van Buren and Jackson had put together did, in fact, break apart and pave the way for the rise of the Republican, the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party.
What?
Excuse me.
I love, as the host of a podcast, I ask questions and you hope that they're all answerable. So I'm going to apologize in advance for what may be an unanswerable question. What is your opinion as to what John Quincy Adams's opinion would have been of the Emancipation Proclamation?
Oh, he would have been a major supporter of it. By the end of his career, the turning point for him came with the independence of Texas and the machinations of the slave power, which lasted for 8 years, 1836 to really more than that, 10 years, 1846. The machinations of the slave power to bring Texas into the Union as one or more slave states. He became increasingly radical in his views on slavery and the damage it was doing to the Republic and its reputation. So that by 1844, this champion of union actually embraced the notion of the North and Mid-Atlantic states seceding from the Union and joining Great Britain, which had begun emancipating its slaves in 1833, joining Great Britain in a broad international anti-slavery movement. So I think he believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was inevitable. I think he believed that civil war was inevitable. I think that was in his mind, probably beginning in the early 1830s. What he consoled himself with, I believe, is that he had made the country strong enough to survive a civil war. And he'd helped to create a national economy. He'd seen the Union spread from coast to coast. He'd seen it grow in power so that it could survive a civil war and not fall prey to some foreign power. I think that may have been probably in the end, his great consolation.
You mentioned his sense of failure, but when he died was it 1847?
I think he died in 48, didn't he?
48, because Jackson died. They're born the same year Jackson dies, I think, in 1845. Sense of failure, but would you argue in any way that he died a happy man? In other words, that he could have a sense of accomplishment, that he fought the good fight as he would have defined it? What do you think crept into his mind that made him think he was a failure?
John Quincy Adams never wrote down, I don't think he ever did not write down a thought or a feeling that he had. 7,000-page diary, but his letters, his mother and father's letters, he and his wife's letters, 2,200, not counting other people that they corresponded with, the correspondence that came to them. I knew what was on his mind. He would say what was on his mind. He would have this debate with himself. The Adams took introspection to a level that that was absolutely unhealthy, I think. So yeah, I knew what it was on. He wasn't, it's a complicated story. And in a sense, the pro-slavery community was almost as diverse as the anti-slavery community. So this is not there was, and in a sense, there was still the sense when he died that America was one people, that we were
right.
that we were a whole country. And that despite the great evil of slavery, that if we were not In reality, a virtuous republic completely, we always had that ideal, and an ideal which he was convinced that every educated, informed American believed in, even slaveholders, even Southerners. I do think that he died believing that the Armageddon would come, but that we would survive.
It's so fascinating. We're going to ask Professor Woods our five questions. I think they're famous, maybe. But the sense of no matter which biography you read or which history you read, multi-volume or just a couple hundred pages, the sense of gloom and doom that pervaded the United States, especially after they were trying to figure out what to do with all the territory won during the Mexican War. I hate to say it's depressing, but I just can't think of another word for it. We had seemed so blessed, lucky in so many ways, but there was one thing we just couldn't figure out. And so many people, so many leaders and writers in the antebellum period just were like, look, this is going to happen. It's just a matter of time. Or as Lincoln said, if the tug has to come, let it come now.
Yeah, it was asked me what he would think about the current situation in the United States, and they have certain expectations as to what I would say. I think what he would be appalled about was the triviality of the issues which divide us compared to the issues which divided America during his lifetime. The absolute absurdity of the vitriol and the animosity which characterizes American political life over issues which, compared to economic and social justice and the end of slavery, appear to be absurd. In that sense, he would, and perhaps still is, looking at us in shock and dismay. Not because we are not divided, not because we are passionate about our views, but it's the sort of insignificance of the issues at question. So
we've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor Randall Woods, are you ready?
Ready.
What was your first job?
Selling women's shoes and selling store in Taylor, Texas when I was 13. And I was well qualified for that because my father died when I was 2 and I was raised by 2 women. So I spent my youth in women's shoe stores.
Forgive my outburst. I'm sorry, but that's one of the more unique answers we've ever had for that question. And this is my 280th podcast interview. So you've run to the top of the heap. Hysterical. Number 2, what was your first concert?
Willie Nelson to Texas OU football game.
Hey, that's a great setting. Man, the Texas-Oklahoma football games back in the day especially were something else. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
The next book.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Lyndon Johnson's "We Shall Overcome" speech to Congress.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Hey?
Living today. He is still the top choice. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Professor Randall Woods. We've discussed his new biography of our 6th president and perhaps our greatest Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams, a man for the whole people, Professor Woods, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast and for writing this book. You give a truly good man his due.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.